This is the James Caird, a lifeboat once involved in one of the greatest rescues in history. Now safely housed at Dulwich College, back in 1916 this resilient boat sailed 800 miles through the roughest seas in the world to find help for 28 men whose ship had been crushed near Antarctica. But to understand why this journey was necessary, we need to go back to the beginning and find out more about one of the greatest polar explorers. Leaving Dulwich College at age 16, Ernest Shackleton joined the Merchant Navy. He learnt to sail and quickly made a name for himself as a popular leader. This reputation led to him being offered a place on the Discovery expedition, led by Captain Scott, that planned to travel to Antarctica. During this time, Antarctica was nearly as mysterious to people as the Moon is for us today, with very few people ever having reached it. Shackleton fell in love with Antarctica after this year on the ice, and after returning home he planned his own trip south, hoping to become the very first person to reach the South Pole. This was known as the Nimrod expedition.
We reached a point within 97 geographical miles of the South Pole. The only thing that stopped us from reaching the actual point was the lack of 50 pounds of food.
The reason for the lack of food, he mentions, was a sad story to do with a pony. These sledges that you can see here in the college cloisters were used on this expedition to carry food and supplies, dragged along by ponies. As Shackleton and his group were on their long, cold march to the pole, one of the ponies, named Socks, fell into a crevasse, dragging a sledge down with it. Disappointed, Shackleton had to turn back, but this trip still made him famous, as he had broken the record for the furthest south any human had ever been. Just 3 years later, however, Shackleton's record was broken, as first Roald Amundsen and then Robert Falcon Scott managed to reach the South Pole. He realized that he had to go back to Antarctica and attempt to break an even more difficult record. It was his plan to become the first person to cross the entire Antarctic continent. This trip was to become known as the Endurance, or Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. It would be difficult, and with a total walking length of over 1,800 miles. Just as his plans were coming together, the first disaster of the expedition struck. The First World War broke out in 1914, so Shackleton wrote to the government asking whether he should stay in the UK to help out. He received a reply from Winston Churchill that simply read, "Proceed." The further south the Endurance sailed, past the equator, the chillier the conditions got. As they got closer to Antarctica, they started to see more and more ice floating on the sea, with local whalers warning them that this was the thickest sea ice they had seen for generations. Nevertheless, Shackleton headed on, believing that his ship would be able to survive the intense cold and ice. Agonizingly close to their destination, the sea ice became too thick, freezing the ship in place. The crew tried to free the Endurance by sawing at the ice, but it was no use. The ice then floated around, dragging the Endurance aimlessly around the sea for 10 whole months. To the crew, the ship became their home, and the ice their playground. They were glad to have been equipped with the latest polar exploration clothing, specially designed by Burberry to keep out the wind and water. Instead of ponies, 69 dogs were on board to help carry the supplies. They became pets for the crew, some sharing very close bonds. Eventually, the pressure within the ice became too great, and the wooden ship could hold out no longer, leaking freezing water into the interior and eventually crushing it completely. The crew were stranded on sheets of ice over the sea, 1,000 miles from inhabited land, and with the wreck of their home and intended transport destroyed. All hope of survival seemed lost. Thankfully, Shackleton had a plan. Having saved 3 lifeboats, the Stancomb Wills, Dudley Docker, and the James Caird, Shackleton decided that the best course of action was to travel further north and nearer to open water. The dogs helped to carry the boats and what was left of the supplies, but as the men grew more starved, there wasn't much else they could eat.
Incredible. Best thing I've ever eaten.
Somehow, Shackleton and his crew made it to water, where they would sail for a whole week in search for land. The Endurance's captain, Frank Worsley, ingeniously used his knowledge of the stars to estimate where they were in the wide ocean, leading them to the remote land, Elephant Island. Grateful at having finally reached dry land, they hauled the boats up and celebrated with their first food and hot drinks for days.
Well, Perth, you were the first person to sit down on Elephant Island anyway.
Yes, sir.
Their celebrations were to be short-lived. Although they had reached land, their chances of being rescued were next to nothing. Many of the crew were malnourished and suffering from frostbite. Shackleton realized if he didn't find help soon, many of them would die. Leaving 22 men on the island, Shackleton and 5 others set out in the James Caird in the hope of sailing 800 miles to the nearest settlement in South Georgia to find help. Out at sea, the James Caird battled waves many times her height, frequently being flooded with freezing cold seawater. If it wasn't for McNish, the crew's carpenter, who had worked in sub-zero conditions to strengthen the boat, Shackleton and the others would have surely drowned. Somehow, after enduring these conditions for 2 weeks, they sighted the island of South Georgia. As the 6 men were discussing the best place to land, the James Caird was caught up in hurricane-force winds and blown back out to sea. This storm would claim vessels far bigger than Shackleton's lifeboat, yet miraculously, the 6 men eventually got back to South Georgia 16 days after leaving Elephant Island. Once again, however, luck was not on their side. They had managed to land on the island this time, but on the wrong side. Their hope for help, the inhabitants of a whaling station, lay 26 miles away on the other side of an island which had never before been crossed. Between them and safety lay unknown terrain with mountains and crevasses. Even worse, 3 of the 6 were now too weak to continue and had to be left on the shore with the James Caird. Nevertheless, Shackleton set out into the unknown, tying himself to the 2 others still strong enough to continue. Meanwhile, the 22 men still on Elephant Island also had to keep themselves alive. They kept warm by sleeping under the remaining 2 lifeboats, but for one man, originally a stowaway on the expedition, it was too late. Suffering from severe frostbite, his toes could not be saved. Their legs were like jelly, having spent more than 2 weeks cramped into a small boat, but Shackleton, Tom Crean and Frank Worsley managed to summon all their reserves of strength and walked for 36 hours straight, eventually coming into sight of their destination. Other than their enormous courage and resilience getting them through the ordeal, the 3 companions each claimed they had felt like a 4th person was accompanying them on their walk, giving them strength and encouragement. Walking into the whaling station, the first people to see them ran off, believing the 3 must have been ghosts or demons, so filthy were they from their exertions. Shackleton immediately went to raise the alarm with the island's manager, whom he had met before, yet the man did not recognize him at first, due to the dirt covering his face and the weight he had lost. After 4.5 months on Elephant Island, and with food supplies almost gone, the rest of the crew were saved by Shackleton's rescue expedition. Shackleton had failed in his attempt to cross the continent, but he had possibly achieved an even more difficult feat in rescuing his crew without the loss of a single man. Back in Britain he was a hero for his exploits, but his achievement was overshadowed by the First World War, which was still raging. When peace eventually returned, Shackleton once again turned his attention to his previous goal, Antarctica. He gave the James Caird to John Quiller Rowett, who had also been at Dulwich College, in return for funding for his new expedition. In 1921, he journeyed south once more aboard the Quest. He never reached Antarctica again, dying en route on the 5th of January 1922. He was buried on South Georgia, the scene of his greatest success, in a grave facing south. The James Caird was given to Dulwich College. Restored by the National Maritime Museum, she now lives in the college's science building.